Welcome to Rebecca Sounds Reveille, brought to you by the Liberty Beacon and TLBTV. We are excited about a topic today that seems to go really under the water, if you will, because we talk about trauma in various forms, but one of the things that we really don't talk about is the childhood trauma and how it affects us in childhood as well as in our adulthood years. And so today we're going to be talking about something called ACE, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences, and its effect on children and adults, and also what you can do if you've been affected by this and how you can recover. Same thing with children. My guest today is a regular guest here on Rebecca Sounds Reveille, and he is an incredible man who is very well-rounded, multifaceted in a number of ways. He's an author, a facilitator, a speaker. He just really loves to take the approach of well-being and put that into creating breakthroughs of just very profound substance. He's authored A Killer's Grace, Seeing True, My Name is Wonder. He has a number of different resources available at his fingertips to help people in their well-beingness all the time. Areas that you can go to see his work is ronaldchapman.com, seeingtrue.com, magneticnorth.com, and leadingpublichealth.com. With me today is my friend and regular guest, Ronald Chapman. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rebecca. Delighted to be here and delighted with our choice of subject matter.
I am too. And what I have found is that trauma is so widespread, and it happens from an early age to an elder age. So golden age, I should say. There is not any sector of life that is immune from trauma. And what is really interesting is a lot of times we don't recognize trauma until we're in our adult years. And by then we are trying to overcome some of the things that happen to us from our childhood if we're recognizing it's coming from there. And it's never too late, but it takes a longer period of time. And so if we can prevent trauma, and if we can address it and begin to overcome it when those things happen, we have a better chance of not having the side effects that come from that. And after researching ACE, it was amazing to me to find out the amount of side effects and the statistics that go along with this, which we really wouldn't correlate to childhood adverse experiences. So can you talk to us a little bit about ACE and how you got involved in that?
Sure. A little bit of context first, Rebecca. Regrettably, when we use the word trauma, people immediately start thinking of battlefield trauma, which certainly counts. They start thinking of horrific things that happen to people. In some cases, it's the classic out-of-body experience that some rape survivors will talk about they literally, they're thrown out of their body. And what we're talking about, and of course it would include that, but the adverse childhood experiences studies aren't looking necessarily to the really graphic things. There was some work done with the Centers for Disease Control and with Kaiser Permanente some years back, where they started looking for factors in childhood that explain all kinds of things, from underperforming lives, chronic disease, low educational outcomes, and so forth. And what they found was, and oftentimes it's being talked about as stress now, because we do jump to conclusions about trauma, but everything from being raised in a household where mental illness is present, families with substance abuse problems, the kinds of things that happen, in some cases, some fairly routine things that we think don't affect children, much of which happen in the early developmental years, the first 5 years, which is when brain development is so important. And so some people right now are saying, oh, come on, Ron. I mean, I fell off my swing set, and what's the big deal? Well, what I'd urge people to do is to get past your skepticism, because the research is compelling that when we add up a number of these factors, and lots of us have more than we imagine, we start finding all kinds of explanations for life outcomes. And it can even include things like exposure to chronic poverty or chronic hunger, being surrounded by violence, even low-grade violence can affect the developing child. And for those who are interested, and then you will see where we go with this, there's an outstanding TED talk by Nadine Burke-Harris, about 18 minutes long. She's a physician out on the West Coast. And she paints probably the most compelling explanation for why this stuff adds up, and how it is we might want to understand it. So it's a huge emergent field, huge upside. But I have to be honest, Rebecca, when we really start looking at what it's telling us, it's devastating to find out that so much of what happens to children ends up undermining their lives in way too many instances.
Well, I have to agree with you on a lot of the points that you have made. The TED Talks video is unbelievable. And if you don't go anywhere else first, that would be the place that will really get your blood pumping. Because, again, what you said is that it is compelling, and very much so. In fact, there are some things that I think a lot of people in the health industry, in first responder, arenas, so on and so forth, they might really have looked at socioeconomics and there being a certain factor of people that tend to have certain types of what we consider trauma, anywhere from abuse to neglect, right? And so that's sort of a myth, because after listening to what Nadine had to say, it is across the board. There is no barrier. There is no isolated community. There isn't any demographics that it's immune. And I will concur with, when I was a deputy sheriff, I had went on a domestic violence call and was very surprised to see that a number of them actually were out of what our images are sort of, profile, even though we don't profile, but I think we do in some ways based on a lot of things that come in from various areas, from our upbringing to media to so on and so forth. And we just make these big assumptions, and all of that is gone out of the water. These things are applicable to anybody that's human. And there's even a recent study that has been done. Your study started in the 90s, correct?
Yeah, this work that was done at CDC and Kaiser Permanente was actually dated back into the 80s.
Okay.
And they've been studying it retrospectively ever since.
Yes, and there was a recent study here in October of this year, 2017, that it delves even further, and it's branching out into this large umbrella of understanding and really being able to identify things. And also there is a lot of recovery and prevention now that states are taking, communities are taking, to ensure that the resiliency is being effective more at a better rate. And there's even abroad, the Scottish arena in grasping this and realizing that this is something that's very significant. What I found very interesting is oftentimes a child is misdiagnosed with ADHD or ADD when it's actually the child responding to the trauma experience. And this is perplexing because we have all these children being misdiagnosed, placed on medication, and really the true issue that needs to be resolved in them is not.
Right. If we go looking very deeply into this, you're exactly right. A whole lot of the things that we think we're identifying are symptomatic. And I really want to stretch people's thinking about this. I mean, it turns out that even a lot of young people's ability to excel in school is compromised by what's been done literally at the brain structure level as a result of these traumas in childhood. That literally they don't have a fair shot unless something is done to mitigate it. And this really stretches, you use the word resilience, which is exactly right. One of the big factors that is coming in is an acknowledgement that children that have resilience, which can be either inborn or acquired, apparently. I'm not a scientist and I don't speak for the scientists, but I'm an interpreter of what I'm being taught and learning when I work in these spaces. Resilience, so you can have two kids in the same family. One can be born with innate resilience. One cannot get innate resilience. They can be exposed to the same stressors, the same traumas. The kid who's got resilience can do okay. The kid without the resilience, his or her life may turn out to be markedly different and underperforming life, under-realized life. So we know that resilience is this huge factor. We also know that a big piece of what mitigates is what I have broadly labeled nurturance.
Okay.
There's a couple of really good examples of this. We've all heard the classic story of someone who comes from some dire circumstances and they manage to excel. And we oftentimes hear, and this is a specific one I've heard a number of times, well, my grandma gave a damn. Okay, so they're in a difficult situation, but they had one adult.
Okay.
One adult, oftentimes a grandmother, that's anecdotally pretty frequent, who was deeply invested in the well-being of the child and apparently supported resilience, provided nurturance, a sense of well-being. We're back to that word again. And the kid was able to thrive despite difficult circumstances. So this idea of nurturance. One of the other things that is really compelling is how proximate the intervention is to the trauma. So as you were talking about first responders, teachers, anybody who's on the front line with children, increasingly now they're being taught to recognize the signs and to as soon as possible put them space with the child. For example, some first responders are being taught when they recognize a child, let's say it's a fire in the house or there's been a burglary or violence. A lot of first responders are being taught now to see the effects of the trauma in the child, get down at ground level with them, don't crash into their space because they're hurting on the inside, but to talk calmly, gently. In fact, to be able to do what we call a brief screening to understand how much the child has been affected. And of course, in the best of all worlds, we'd like to refer children. And this stuff applies to adults too. I mean, you can be a 28-year-old person who's exposed to violence or trauma, and the same thing would be valuable. So there's a whole lot of things going on that are, I mean, they are encouraging, but it is still shocking to find out how much these stressors in our lives can undermine us.
Mm-hmm. And ACE is categorized in 3 different group settings. You have your abuse, neglect, and then household dysfunction.
Right.
And under that, there are some areas that you can kind of say, yes, that has happened to me. Yes, no, it has not.
Right.
And if you end up having a number anywhere from 1 to 10 of these different types of events happen, those place you into risk categories for chronic illnesses.
Right. Yes.
And I think that this is a huge awakening, because a lot of times we think that asthma, diabetes, HIV, and other things are behavior related or are exposure related. And in this instance, it's an exposure that has been unspoken.
Yeah, and what's really cool in this space too, there's another really excellent TED talk about this that I'm going to forget the name of the person, but so part of what resiliency would seem to support in nurturance, one of the things they've learned, at least in terms of cardiovascular health, is that our relationship to stress alters the body's response. So literally at the chemical level within the body, if we have or are able to find a positive frame of reference for the stress in the body, for the stress that has fallen upon us, it literally provides protective chemistry in the body, hormones, that are protective against chronic disease. If we have a negative response to the stressors, we don't get the protective factors. So it turns out, and I mean, this makes perfectly good sense, that if we think about the evolution of humanity, Rebecca, that the people who were well supported in dealing with the hardships of life, they managed to live longer, thrive, presumably reproduce. The gene pool was reinforced with people who were survivors because their body adapted, because they had enough resilience to endure. And so, it's epigenetics in practice. It's transference across generations. And the more and more we learn this, I'm just going to use I think it's a horrific example. If you're a child growing up in any of the war-torn regions of the Middle East right now, and you've been exposed to, for example, if you're a child or were a child or have been a child in, say, Afghanistan, which essentially has been under attack from either Russians or the forces from the West. I forget what we called ourselves, but if you think about it, they've been exposed almost nonstop to systemic violence.
Yes.
So you've got generations of children who have been horribly affected by this. And of course, because of what we know this is going to do with their lives, we can predict bad outcomes of all kinds.
Right.
But there's a really important point here, because I want to keep reminding people, because we have such a judgment about these things. That doesn't mean that any one child won't thrive.
I agree with you. And
it doesn't mean that we look at a kid and go, well, see, that kid's fine, so this stuff's all a bunch of nonsense. We have to understand that it is very person-centric in terms of how those things are internalized. What we're talking about is population level impact. So sorry to interrupt you there, but please go ahead.
No, you're right. And I mean, two examples come to mind in what you have said just a minute ago and here right now. And the first one is when it comes to, you said a grandmother nurturing. And I know someone who's had significantly trauma after trauma after trauma from childhood through adulthood. And the one thing that person had said to me, and I was just having this conversation with someone the other day, I said, this is the kind of grandmother that I would like to be. And that is, he said, out of everybody in my life, my grandmother was the most important thing to me. Most important, not thing, but person to me. And I thought about that, and I thought, if this person who has been through so much placed so much value in the relationship out of all of the other family members, that person had to have been a great support system for him, you know? And so I thought, that's what I want to be. But I didn't even realize the impact, like you just said, in that that's what creates resiliency, is And it's not just a grandmother. It can be any person that's offering support and nurturing and love, right?
Right. Well, yeah. So let's talk about another story we hear all the time. We hear the story about that one teacher, right? That one teacher
Yes.
who made, I mean, Freedom Writers, that great movie and story, true story, was about one remarkable teacher who somehow or another had it in her. And again, we hear this story every now and again, who had it in her to be that kind of nurturing, supportive presence in kids' lives. And it doesn't have to be a grandmother. It doesn't have to be a blood relative. Any of us. I have a friend out in New Mexico who volunteered as a big sister some years ago to a young woman who's now in her early 20s. And it is really clear that my friend acting as a big sister made all the difference in the world for that young woman.
Mm-hmm.
They're close as they can be now. And I got chills thinking about it. I mean, just the willingness to show up once a week in a kid's life over a course of years, to be that rock, to be that supportive, nurturing presence made all the difference in the world. So, and that's really good news because some families just don't have it in them. They're just not, there's not going to be a grandmother or an aunt or an uncle who can
Yes.
hold that space.
Yes. And like you were saying, and this was my second example, is you have two children that come from the same home. The parents provide the same exact nurture and love and or whatever, however the parenting is. And one child ends up with a different set of issues that they need to face in their life, and the other excels at things that the other child does not. And so what came to my mind is a family who has one child that ends up making all of these choices and landing up in prison. And then you have the brother or sister who ends up being a police officer and excelling in that field. And those are just completely opposite ends of the spectrum. But like you said, this is very individualistic in how we respond to our traumas. And that would also mean in how we receive the support for our resiliency and from whom it is. So while I might be comfortable talking to mom or dad, brother or sister may not.
Right.
And their support may come from a teacher or a big sister
Or a neighbor.
big brother.
A minister, a youth minister, or there's just a long list. You know, you used a particular word. I want to tease something out here. You use the word choices. So, and I'm not going to pretend like we don't choose things. I get that. But it's useful to understand that what the data is telling us is that the capacity to choose well is undermined as a result of this exposure to toxic stress.
Yes.
So, and this is space I explored in A Killer's Grace, as you well know, is as much as we would like to hold people individually accountable, and I know why we do that, it's culturally necessary, I understand that. But when we look deeply at what the large level data tells us, what we know is that if you put any kid, here's the example I use. If we made 1 million carbon copies of you, if we cloned you 1 million times, and we dropped all these exact versions of you, Rebecca, in zip codes across the country, what we would find is that maybe about 15 or 20% of the exact versions of you dropped into what we might call low resource communities where they're exposed to stress, there's not sufficient nurturance, there's abandonment, neglect, all those things. Or perhaps 15% of them would not be able to get an education, would not be able to get economic opportunity. They may have very bad life outcomes. And part of what we have to do is, I'm not proposing we don't hold people accountable for their lives. But my God, what a compassion space for us to understand that 150,000 of the copies of you are starting off with a limited opportunity because of how this stuff has affected them. And
yes.
to label them as making bad choices is to fail to understand the dynamic which is not only not compassionate, it can't lead to solutions. If our solution was trauma mitigation for children rather than incarceration at the age of pick whatever, I mean, that is a whole different deal and approach.
Yes, it is.
So, and I know since you've been in law enforcement and all that, I mean, I'm sure you can appreciate that just a huge difference between, my goodness, a teacher at the age of 7 rather than going to prison for 20 years at the age of 22. I mean,
Yes.
that's a real easy decision for me.
Well, along the lines of what you're saying, my viewpoint has always been this, and I've had other people kind of say something or looking at me in an odd way when I would agree with someone in whatever situation that surfaced.
Yeah.
And they were talking about the situation, and it may not make sense to someone else, but I told them their feelings are valid. What you're feeling is valid because that's based on what they know, what they've experienced, and what tools that they've had at their hand to just bring all that together and have that viewpoint. It's valid. It doesn't matter in my mind if it's right or wrong. In that person's mind, based on their life experiences, that's what they have come to the conclusion of. And so a support person can go to that person and widen the scope of what's available or different things by doing a nurturing and loving role to that other person.
Mm-hmm.
And we learn and we grow from that, and that does help us overcome different types of trauma. The biggest challenge, I think, in a lot of this is as adults who are experiencing some of the side effects from childhood trauma and from the ACE are not really in a position to acknowledge that unless they have heard about this, and that there is a way to recover from it.
Yes. And again, we're going to really encourage people to go listen to Dr. Burke's TED talk about this, because what she found in the medical system, she's in the medical system. And when I'll give you the short story here, is I know you listened to it, is our listeners need to know she saw the effects. I mean, she could see it, she could feel it, she could touch it, she could predict outcomes for children, for young people, for adults, based on these 10 questions in the ACE survey. And she started trying to enlighten the medical system. And she ran into all kinds of difficulties. And her main conclusion, and I think she's right, is that what this requires us to do is understand how much all of us have been affected in negative ways. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to deal with that. If we talk to Carl Jung, he'd say that's because we don't want to face our shadow selves. We don't want to deal with these things. It's so much easier to look to the zip code in our community where there's bad things happening and go, oh, see, that's the problem there, rather than saying, oh, you know what? My neighbor in that nice suburban home has been exposed. The child next door is being exposed to domestic violence day in and day out.
Yes.
Even though they're going to a good school in their suburban neighborhood and they're driving a couple of Mercedes and they've got a really lovely stucco house with Spanish tile roof, and they're both employed. I mean, this is hard medicine, Rebecca, for us to go, oh, this could be me. This could be the kid next door. This could be the person next door.
Yes.
So awareness in public health, we talk about awareness being the first intervention. Just knowing something is happening opens up the possibility of a solution. When we don't, which is why this ACEs work is so important. When we don't know it, we have no choice for an intervention. And so it's like, yay, we're finally seeing this.
And I think that there's a lot of assumption, especially when we look at children. You see this large campaign about childhood obesity and some of these other things, and it's not necessarily, well, some may even say, okay, well, it's the self-esteem. But if you really peel it down, that child may have been exposed to abuse or neglect or some kind of household dysfunction where one of the parents are incarcerated, or dealing with a mental illness, or there's alcoholism or drug abuse, or in what we're finding now is coming out in a lot of households is human trafficking.
Yes.
And so those all impact children, and they respond in a way that they can cope with. And we make the assumption that even their peers do, that they are just overeating, or you can attribute this or that, and it's really that there has been some type of exposure that needs addressing.
Yeah, and I know this stretches people's belief and understanding because we really do want to blame the person. But you're exactly right. When you start looking at what the data tells us, what the research shows, these are contributing factors. And here's what we have to get our head around. Literally, the structure and function of the brain is altered by exposure to these toxic experiences. The amygdala is overactivated. The amygdala is the fear, flight, freeze, fight hormone producing organ in the body. And so, I mean, literally the brain structure is different. The the secretion of chemicals and hormones is different. And so suddenly we begin to see there's all these other factors. And then, of course, we have the opportunity to start intervening in the prevention space. Now, I don't know if we talked about this before, if I told you about this. There's one quick interesting thing that may not be so quick by the time we talk it through. The emergent field is research in post-traumatic growth, Rebecca.
Okay.
It turns out most of the studies been done on PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSS, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Because we like studying abnormality. It turns out there's a field called the study of post-traumatic growth. Because what they're trying to understand is it's a branching effect, right? And what they're trying to study is not just the stuff that causes you to end up with bad outcomes, but what's the stuff that leads to good outcomes. So we're actually studying the health side of it. And in fact, I was at a book fair recently, trying to sell some books and talk to some folks, and I happened to sit down next to Dr. Pamela Antoinette, and I said, "This was really funny, Rebecca." I go, "So, Dr. Antoinette, what are you up to?" She goes, "Well, I work on post-traumatic growth." And I said, "No, really?" And she goes, "You know what that is?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely. I'm writing it in the sequel to A Killer's Grace." And she goes, "I don't run into anybody who knows about this because we so want to study the toxic side rather than the wholeness, the well-beingness side."
That's so true.
I have started up a conversation about, I want to understand more about what she knows about what is it in this resiliency space, the human development things that we can do. Because the evidence would show if we intervene, we can prevent a whole lot of bad life outcomes. And of course, the earlier we can intervene, before the age of 5 would be ideal, the better and better the likelihood of success is. So I mean, it's actually very promising. I actually just had a rush of feelings about the thought that we might be able to learn how to help people produce post-traumatic growth, rather than to be doomed to end up with these unfortunate outcomes as a result of it. So now your listeners have heard about post-traumatic growth. That may be new information too.
I know this is an unexplored topic, especially here on the show. But I think that the tools and resources that people need should be given to them at very young ages, and not wait until they're in their late teens or early adulthood or even later in adulthood. Because if a child understands how to respond to something and view things in a way that's healthy, they have a better chance at adapting or adjusting to a situation that is traumatic when it happens later and the nurturer is not around them to assist them, or the environment is different. they have that. They are equipped with the ability to get through that situation a lot easier and have less side effects. And I'm not saying that we're going to be completely immune to emotion. No, not at all. But we'll be able to get through it in a much healthier aspect than we would if we didn't have that established and trained in us at an early age. And
Yeah.
the things that our education system really lack is that, and along with how to have healthy relationships through good communication.
Mhm. All of those are mitigating approaches. All of them contribute. I was just thinking of a friend of mine here in Atlanta. She recently had her baby prematurely. She and her husband know about this stuff. They've got the books, they've got the research. I've been talking with it. Well, her baby was born with insufficiently developed sphincter muscle in the esophagus. So
Okay.
what that means is that she's a very colicky baby. Um,
Okay.
because literally what happens in premature babies sometimes is they don't get the little valve that keeps stomach acid from washing up.
Okay.
Currently, she sleeps at best about 30 minutes at a time, and then she wakes up crying quite often. Well, mama and daddy are really stressed by all of this. But here's the beauty of this. They know what the research shows, Rebecca, and they are doing all the kinds of things you would, and it is so hard because it's asking much of them. But they know the data, they know the consequences, and so the baby is swaddled and held close, and they rock her all the time, and all the people who visit know that they're coming over to provide support, so that baby's getting nurturance no matter what, despite the fact that it's a horrible situation. Now, so this is like what it is to understand this. I want to contrast that with a woman I have been doing some work with for some time, who is about my age, so she's almost 60. At a time when we didn't know this, she had some similar challenges. Her parents put her on her back in a bathroom and closed the door. They were just going to let her outgrow the colic. Well, not
Oh my goodness.
well, but we didn't know any better, and they had no capacity to know how to deal with this crying baby.
Mm-hmm.
They were under-resourced. So you get this, I mean, here it is, right? I mean, on the one hand, we can see how, and I'm sympathetic to any parent, any teacher, anybody who is pressed so hard to deliver the nurturance that a child needs. So I'm deeply sympathetic, but at the same time, it's like, I mean, we need to understand this, start the intervention early. And then, as you say, there are a number of things we can do by remodeling, teaching people, reparenting. The whole therapeutic arena is beginning to learn how to do trauma work with those who've been negatively affected. So there's a lot opening up, but to your point, I mean, it starts with recognition.
I agree with you, and I am just amazed by this. I know that there is so much more that we can talk about, and this actually is something that needs to be just shared, and the message and the understanding of this just rippling out from everywhere, because I think that this will help people from being misdiagnosed. It will help from a lot of other side effects that people are experiencing from that. And if we can prevent it and we can help people recover, then we're leading healthier lives. And this is very, very exciting. So I'm really interested in being as supportive as I can in this, with everything that you're doing with ACE. And in addition to that, I'd like to, share with the audience that the resources are available. Ronald Chapman is available to assist you. There is a lot here. We encourage you to definitely go to his website and get more information and start learning about this, preventing things in your own families and those around you. This is very exciting to uncover and know that we actually can get our hands on and start doing something today. It's not something that has to be waited on. It's something that we can just really embrace in this moment.
I think that's a good plug. And for those of you who are skeptical, please go listen to Dr. Harris's TED. I mean, it'll change your perspective. For those of you who need support, there are lots of resources available. But I really think the starting point for all of us is to gather all the information we can, and we've touched the tip of the proverbial iceberg.
Yes.
And
yes.
I'm hopeful that I will learn enough about this post-traumatic growth that I can talk intelligently more about it when I have the opportunity. I actually think I understand it, but I'm not sufficiently convinced enough to feel like I can talk coherently about it. But I'm enthralled by the possibility of where we're going with this, because it means a big difference to so many people, including probably some of those that are close to us.
I will agree with you, and it's something that I'm going to do further research on as well. I want to thank you so much for being with us today. This has been very informative, and I'm very excited about what's to come, and I really want to assist in any way I can. So know that that's an extension of my hand to you and what you're doing. I'm really appreciative of you having been involved with this from the very beginning, way back in the 80s, and that you are moving forward with it in a continual motion. This is awesome, and I thank you for that and for being on the show today.
My pleasure.
And thank all of you for watching and tuning in today. Make sure to get this message out to your friends and family and start taking a look at things in your own life. There's ways that you can actually assess what risk category that you fall under in the ACE spectrum, and there are things that you can do. We'd be more than happy to assist you in your recovery as well. So you can go to ronaldchapman.com or any of the other links that I shared with you at the beginning of the show, and you'll definitely want to get a copy or 2 or 3 of some of Ron's books and get those out there, because the information that he's sharing is pertinent. It is useful, and it's going to really lead to healthier lives all the way around, from prevention to recovery. Thank you so much for watching.